The night of June 6, 1944. The Sibutu Passage, a deep channel of black water between Borneo and the southern Philippines. A full moon hung over the strait, and that moon was a problem. On the surface, running fast and low, sat the American submarine Harder. Her captain had brought her in close to a convoy of 3 tankers and their 2 escorting destroyers, close enough to fire, when a Moonlight caught her hull and gave her away. One of the destroyers, the Minazuki, heeled over and turned straight for her. A destroyer charging a surface submarine had one purpose: ram it or hold it under with depth charges until the air ran out and the steel gave way. Commander Samuel Dealey did not dive. He swung Harder's stern toward the oncoming ship, held his nerve while the range fell and the destroyer's bow wave climbed white in the moonlight, and fired 3 torpedoes from his aftertubes. 2 hit. The Minazuki broke apart and went down in about 5 minutes, her own depth charges detonating as she sank, killing all but 45 of her crew. That was one destroyer on one night, in a single week, that would turn a calm man from Texas into a legend and help empty the Anchorage of an entire fleet. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The story that grew up around Harder and her skipper is a clean one. A single submarine, sent to the doorstep of the Imperial Japanese Navy's main fleet Anchorage, sank 5 destroyers in 5 days, frightened a Japanese admiral, and drove the enemy fleet out to sea ahead of schedule. The boat earned the motto "Hit him again, Harder." Her captain earned the Medal of Honor. The numbers and the nickname have been repeated so often that they have set like concrete. The record is more complicated than the legend, and in one way that matters most, it is larger. To see why, you have to begin with where the war stood in the late spring of 1944. The United States had spent 2.5 years clawing its way west across the Pacific, island by island, and the next great objective was the Marianas. Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Airfields built there would put the new B-29 bomber within reach of the Japanese home islands, and both sides understood exactly what that meant. The Japanese plan was to let the American fleet commit itself to the Marianas, then meet it with everything the Navy had left in one decisive battle, the kind of single hammer blow that might break the American advance and force a negotiated peace. The Japanese had a name for the plan: a go. The fleet meant to deliver that blow was gathering at a place most Americans had never heard of. Tawi-Tawi, a small island at the southwestern tip of the Philippines, off the northeast coast of Borneo. The Japanese chose it for one reason above all others: oil. By 1944, American submarines had sent so many Japanese tankers to the bottom that fuel had grown scarce in the home islands. Tawi-Tawi sat close to the oil fields of Borneo, and the crude pumped out of Tarakan was unusual stuff. It could be burned in a warship's boiler straight from the ground, with no refining, though it was volatile enough to make any sailor uneasy about a hit near the bunkers. So the fleet anchored where the fuel was and waited for its moment. There was a second weakness in that fleet, and it would shape everything Harder did off Tawi-Tawi. The Japanese Navy was running short of destroyers. Through most of the war, American submarine skippers treated Japanese destroyers as predators to be avoided. A destroyer was fast, carried sonar and racks of depth charges, and existed to kill submarines. You did not go looking for a fight with one if there was any way around it. That arithmetic changed in April 1944. American codebreakers, reading Japanese naval traffic through the secret effort known as Ultra, had worked out that Japan was running dangerously low on destroyers. The savage fighting around the Solomon Islands in 1942 and 1943 had cost the Imperial Navy a long line of them, and the survivors were stretched thin, escorting convoys and screening the fleet at the same time. Sink enough destroyers, and you did more than send ships down. You stripped the protection away from everything else that floated. From that spring on, American Submarine Command made destroyers a priority target. Few captains took to that order the way Sam Dealey did. Samuel David Dealey was born in Dallas, Texas, in 1906 and graduated from the Naval Academy in 1930. He was not the loud, jet-jawed type the recruiting posters favored. The Academy Yearbook, the Lucky Bag, recorded a single quality that his crews would one day stake their lives on. The greater the stress, the more he smiled. His early career read like a tour of the pre-war fleet. The battleship Nevada, a short posting to the destroyer Rathburn, then submarine school at New London in the summer of 1934, followed by a string of boats, the S-34, the S-24, the Nautilus, the base, and a stretch ashore at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. By 1939, he was executive officer of the old battleship Wyoming, then doing duty as a gunnery training ship, and after that executive officer of the destroyer Reuben James. That last assignment carries a weight Dealey could not have felt at the time. The Reuben James was torpedoed by a German U-boat at the end of October 1941, more than a month before Pearl Harbor, the first United States Navy warship lost to enemy action in the war. Dealey had moved on by then, but the ship he had helped run went down in the cold North Atlantic while America was still officially at peace, and more than 100 of her men died with her. Whatever the war was about to become, he had already lost shipmates to it. In 1941, he took the prospective command of the training submarine S-20, relieving an officer named John Cromwell. That name is worth holding on to, because Cromwell would later ride the submarine sculpin to the bottom rather than risk being tortured into giving up secrets he carried, and would receive the Medal of Honor for it. The submarine force was small in those years. Its men knew one another, served under one another, and mourned one another by name. In December 1942, Dealey commissioned a new boat at the Electric Boat Yard in Groton, Connecticut. She was a Gatto-class fleet submarine, 311 feet long, fast on the surface at around 21 knots, and slow and nearly blind beneath it. She carried 10 torpedo tubes, 6 in the bow and 4 in the stern, and 24 torpedoes. Her name was Harder, after a small fish. Her captain was 36 years old. The boat worked up off New London and then started for the war by way of the Panama Canal. Even getting to the Pacific proved hazardous in ways no one had planned for. Crossing the Caribbean on the surface in May 1943, Harder was set upon by a United States Navy patrol plane, a PBY Catalina, whose crew took her for a U-boat, raked her starboard side with machine gun fire, and dropped 2 bombs. Dealey crash-dived and threw the boat into hard maneuvers, and both bombs missed. It was a small, almost absurd episode, but it was the kind of thing that happened in a war fought by tired men reading shapes on the water, and it would echo, far less harmlessly, in the way Harder herself finally died. Before Harder ever sank a destroyer, she had to survive her own torpedoes. The popular memory of the wartime American submarine is one of quiet, deadly efficiency, the silent service throttling Japan's lifelines one ship at a time. The truth of the first 2 years is uglier. The standard American torpedo of 1942 and early 1943, the Mark 14, was a mechanical failure on several counts at once. It tended to run deeper than its setting, sliding harmlessly beneath the target. Its magnetic detonator fired early or did not fire at all. Its backup contact exploder would crumple on a square hit and do nothing. Captains who worked for hours into perfect firing position watched their torpedoes thump against an enemy hull like thrown stones, then paid for the attempt with a long beating from the escorts. The Navy was slow to believe its own skippers, and the worst of the problems were not run down and fixed until well into 1943. Crews came home from patrol after patrol convinced their weapons were defective, and were told, in so many words, that they were simply missing. It took most of 2 years, and the stubborn testing pushed by officers like Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who commanded the Pacific Submarine Force, before the Navy admitted the torpedoes themselves were broken and set about curing them. Harder's early patrols show the damage in miniature. On her first patrol off the coast of Japan in the summer of 1943, her opening attack collapsed when a torpedo exploded 15 seconds after launch, 15 seconds, announcing her position to the escort. Diving to get clear, she drove hard into the bottom, jammed herself in the mud, and rode out a dozen depth charges before she could tear free almost 4 hours later. Over the patrols that followed, she fired spreads that ran erratic, ran in circles, or struck home as duds. On one occasion, she put 11 torpedoes into a single or carrier for 2 hits, and the ship still refused to sink until heavy weather finished what the torpedoes could not. Her second and third patrols, through the autumn of 1943, ground on in the same vein. Off the coast of Honshu in September, she put a torpedo into the cargo ship Koyo Maru that turned out to be a dud, though the ship flooded and sank under tow anyway. 2 days later, she sank the freighter Yoko Maru outright, then rode out an inaccurate depth charging from the convoy escort. After a submerged attack on 2 more cargo ships, a Japanese plane and the escorts pinned her down under a barrage of bombs and depth charges that ran close to 48 hours and very nearly drained her batteries dry. She sank the freighter Kachisan Maru a few days later, survived another close pattern, and then fired 3 torpedoes at a tanker at point-blank range and watched all 3 run under the hull without going off. Before that patrol ended, she had also sent down the freighter Kawa Maru and the tanker Daisha Maru. Her third patrol put her into the Marianas at the end of October as part of a 3-boat wolf pack with the Snook and the Pargo, ordered to head off any Japanese attempt to reinforce Tarawa before the Marines landed there. The pack lost contact almost at once, and Harder hunted alone, sinking a pair of cargo ships before spending the last of her torpedoes and turning for home with her worn-out engines due for replacement at last. There's a gap that runs through the whole submarine war between what a submarine's crew believed they had done and what the enemy's own records later showed. Harder's story sits squarely inside that gap. After her first patrol, she was credited with sinking 3 ships. The post-war examination of Japanese records cut that to 1. The cause was not dishonesty. In the confusion of a night surface action or a deep submerged attack, a captain saw an explosion, heard a hull breaking up on sonar, and reported a sinking in good faith. Confirming it meant matching the claim against enemy records that only became available after the war, through the work of a body called the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee. Their accounting was cold and unsentimental, and it trimmed nearly every famous tally in the fleet. That fact is going to matter a great deal before this story is over. By the spring of 1944, the torpedoes mostly worked, and Dealey had grown into one of the most dangerous attack commanders in the Pacific. His 4th patrol, in April, gave the first clear sign of what he was becoming, and it showed 2 very different sides of the man within a fortnight. The first side appeared off the island of Wolei in the Western Carolines, where Harder had been sent to pick up airmen shot down during American carrier raids. On the 1st of April, she went in after a downed pilot, Lieutenant John Galvin, stranded on a reef under Japanese sniper fire. Dealey took his submarine in until she touched bottom against the coral, close enough that 3 of his men, Lieutenant Samuel Logan and 2 enlisted sailors, Francis Ryan and J.W. Thomason, could go over the side into the surf, pushing a rubber raft toward the flyer. A rescue float plane landed nearby and accidentally cut the line tying the raft to the boat. Another man, gunner's mate Freeman Paquette, then swam a fresh line out through the swell. They hauled the whole party, pilot included, back aboard. Every man in that rescue received the Navy Cross. It tells you something about the captain that he was willing to ground a fleet submarine on a reef in daylight, under fire, to bring home one pilot he had never met. 12 days later, the other side of Dealey showed itself. A Japanese aircraft spotted Harder south of Guam and sent the destroyer Ikazuchi to hunt her down. As the destroyer bore in, Dealey held his fire and let the range fall to about 900 yards before he loosed his torpedoes. 2 struck. The Ikazuchi went down fast, her depth charges going off as she sank, and not one of her crew survived. Dealey's report on the action became one of the most quoted lines of the entire submarine war. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 Jap destroyer. There's a grim footnote to that sinking. 2 years earlier, in the aftermath of the Battle of the Java Sea, the Ikazuchi had stopped in open water to rescue more than 400 British sailors from the cruiser Exeter and the destroyer Encounter. Men left swimming when their ships went down. The same destroyer that had saved enemy lives in 1942 lost every one of her own in 1944. War keeps no tidy ledger. Between those 2 encounters, Harder also sank the freighter Matsue Maru, and before she left the area, she surfaced off Wolei and shelled the Japanese garrison there with her deck gun, the 4-inch piece mounted on her foredeck for exactly that kind of close surface work. Harder finished that patrol at Fremantle, in Western Australia, in early May, and her captain pinned on his 4th Navy Cross. Late in the month, she put to sea again, and this time the assignment was one Dealey had asked for himself. He wanted the water off Tawi-Tawi, the doorstep of the Japanese fleet, and the destroyers he knew he would find there. She sailed from Fremantle on May 26, 1944 in company with another submarine, the Redfin, a detail the legend tends to leave out. Harder did not work alone, then or later. She took up her station near the Sibutu Passage, the channel that fed the great Anchorage, and she waited. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The opening night, June 6th, has already been described. The convoy in the Moonlight, the Minazuki turning to attack, the 2 hits, the destroyer gone in 5 minutes. What the legend usually leaves out is that the night was no clean sweep. After the Minazuki went under, the 2nd destroyer kept coming, and Harder fired all 6 of her bow tubes at it. Every torpedo missed. The escort held her down with depth charges long enough for the tankers, the targets she had actually been stalking, to slip away into the dark. Dealey had killed a destroyer and lost the convoy. He stayed on station. The next morning, a Japanese plane found Harder again and guided a 2nd destroyer, the Hayanami, straight toward her. This time, Dealey fought submerged. As the destroyer closed in, he turned the boat hard, a move the Hayanami never read, and fired 3 torpedoes at short range. 2 struck her amidships. The destroyer's magazine went up in a single tearing blast, and she was gone in under a minute. Of her crew, somewhere around 208 men died. 45 lived. Harder took another long beating from the depth charges and worked her way clear. By late afternoon, as many as 8 Japanese destroyers were combing the water for her, and she slipped away from all of them. That same evening, Harder did something that had nothing to do with sinking ships, and it is the part of the patrol most worth remembering for what it says about the boat's true range of work. She crept up to the Japanese-held coast of Borneo, launched 2 folding canoes, and brought aboard 6 Australian commandos of a special reconnaissance unit who had been operating behind enemy lines. 2 more Australians were already on board to help run the pickup. A submarine that spent its days hunting destroyers spent one night as a ferry for soldiers on a secret mission. Both were the job, and Dealey gave the 2nd the same care as the 1st. By now, the Japanese knew a submarine was loose at the mouth of their anchorage, and destroyers were sortying in numbers to find it. Dealey was careful with them. On several contacts over those days, he studied the setup, decided he did not like it, and pulled away without firing. The reckless gambler the legend was, in practice, a man who turned down more shots than he took. On the evening of June 8th, he found several destroyers sweeping toward him in line abreast, and worked into a position where 2 of them overlapped in his sights. He fired. The 1st torpedo missed ahead of the nearest ship. The 2nd and 3rd hit the destroyer Tanikaze, whose boilers blew apart, and she sank almost at once. 114 of her men died, among them her captain, who lived just long enough to be pulled from the sea. The Tanikaze had her own long history before that night. 2 years earlier, on the day after the Battle of Midway, she had been sent back alone to confirm whether the burning carrier Hiryu was still afloat. American carrier planes caught her in the open, more than 60 dive bombers in a single attack, as she dodged every bomb, shot one of them down, and lost just 6 men to splinters. She had taken almost the worst the Pacific could throw at one destroyer in 1942 and lived. Now, in a narrow channel off Borneo, 3 torpedoes from a single submarine finished her in a matter of minutes. Dealey saw a flash beyond the Tanikaze and reported a 2nd destroyer hit and sunk. He was credited with it during the war. After the war, when his claims were laid against Japanese records, that 2nd sinking could not be found anywhere. No Japanese destroyer was lost in that spot beyond the Tanikaze. It is the first of the 2 phantom kills inside the famous count, and there is no shame in it. He saw what he saw in the dark and the spray, and he reported it as he saw it. 2 days later came the encounter that should have killed him. On June 10th, Harder sighted a heavy Japanese force standing out from the Anchorage, 3 battleships for cruisers and a screen of destroyers. A Japanese plane spotted the submarine and vectored a destroyer straight at her. Dealey did the thing that had worked for him before, and that almost no other skipper would dare to try twice. He aimed at the oncoming destroyer head-on, what submariners called a down-the-throat shot, firing at the narrow bow of a ship coming directly at you with no angle to spare, and he let his torpedoes go. He believed 2 hit. Then Harder went deep, and the sinking destroyer passed only about 80 feet over her hull as she dropped. He was credited with that destroyer too. It is the second kill the post-war records cannot confirm. The ship may have been badly damaged. The Navy's own historians allow that much, but no loss in the Japanese books lines up with it. Either way, the act itself is beyond dispute. A fleet submarine, spotted from the air with enemy battleships in plain view, turned into the charge of an oncoming destroyer, put a torpedo down its throat, and let the wreck pass over her in the dark. Whether the destroyer went down or limped away, the nerve it took to do that was the same. The day after, Dealey closed the Tawi-Tawi Anchorage itself to take a careful look. He counted cruisers and destroyers, but noted no battleships, worked his way back out to safer water, and sent off a report on everything he had seen to Admiral Raymond Spruance, who would command the American fleet in the battle everyone knew was coming. That single report, the position and the movement of the enemy fleet, was worth more than any one ship Harder sank that week. The legend and the record line up at exactly one point, and it happens to be the most important one of all. By the time Harder turned for Australia, she had been off Tawi-Tawi for less than a week, and in that week she had thrown the Japanese fleet command into something close to panic. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who led the Japanese carrier force, had no way of knowing that one submarine was responsible for the destroyers dying around his anchorage. The attacks had come from different directions on different days. To him, it looked like a pack of submarines, a deliberate concentration of American boats lying in wait at the very mouth of his harbor. He drew the only sensible conclusion. The anchorage was no longer safe, and he could not let his fleet be picked apart at its moorings before the decisive battle was even joined. So Ozawa moved up his departure. The fleet that had been sitting at Tawi-Tawi, husbanding its scarce fuel and waiting for its moment, sortied early, its careful timetable bent out of shape by the fear of submarines that, for the most part, were not even there. That is the literal meaning of the fleet vanishing. Not sunk at anchor, but flushed into the open, moving before it meant to, its plan disturbed by one boat and the man who commanded her. The story of 5 destroyers in 5 days gets the spirit of it exactly right and the arithmetic wrong. 3 of those sinkings hold up under examination. 2 do not. But the strategic result, an entire enemy fleet pulled off its own schedule by the work of a single submarine, is solid history, and it is far bigger than any body count. What that fleet sailed into a week and a half later was a disaster. On the 19th and the 20th of June 1944, off the Marianas, Ozawa's carriers met the American fleet in the largest carrier battle ever fought. American fighter pilots, flying better aircraft with better training and guided onto their targets by radar, shot Japanese air groups out of the sky in numbers so lopsided that the American air crews called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over the 2 days, the Japanese lost 3 fleet carriers and several hundred aircraft. 2 of those carriers, the Taiho and the Shokaku, were sunk not by aircraft at all, but by other American submarines, the Albacore and the Kavala. The third, the Hayo, went down to an aerial torpedo on the second day. By the most cited count, well over 300 Japanese carrier aircraft were shot out of the sky in the fighting against a handful of American losses in the air. Japanese naval air power, rebuilt with such care after the losses at Midway, was broken in an afternoon and never recovered for the rest of the war. Harder did not win that battle. It was won by carrier pilots and anti-aircraft gunners and 2 other submarines, and it is no service to her crew to pretend otherwise. What is true, and what the Navy's own historians credit her with, is that the timing which put the Japanese fleet at a disadvantage and a reconnaissance that helped the Americans find it, traced in part back to one boat off Tawi-Tawi. That is the honest measure of her contribution, not the decisive stroke. A real and weighable hand on the scale at the moment it counted. When Harder reached Darwin in late June, after a last sweep into the Florida Sea, General Douglas MacArthur came aboard and pinned an Army Distinguished Service Cross on Dealey on the spot, an unusual honor for the commander of the Army's theater forces to hand a Navy submariner. The full accounting of what Dealey and Harder had done would not be settled until after the war. During the fighting, they were credited with sinking 6 Japanese destroyers, along with 2 escort vessels and a long column of merchant ships and tankers. The post-war review confirmed 4 of the destroyers: the Ikazuchi from the 4th Patrol, and the Minazuki, the Hayanami, and the Tanikaze from the 5th. The 2 unnamed destroyers from the Knights of the 8th and the 10th of June fell off the list. Even after that correction, 4 confirmed destroyers stood as the most credited to any single American submarine in the entire war. The legend had to give back 2 ships. It kept the crown. By the end of 5 patrols, the men around Dealey could see what the war was costing him. His executive officer judged that he was worn down past the safe point, and other officers agreed. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, who commanded the submarines in that theater, sat Dealey down and told him plainly that he should give up the boat and take a rest. Dealey asked instead to make 1 more patrol. About a third of his crew was due to rotate home, replaced by men who had never gone to sea in Harder, and he felt he owed it to them to break them in himself before he stepped away. Christie gave way. It was the kind of decision that looks like devotion from one angle and like exhaustion overruling judgment from another, and the hard truth is that both readings are probably correct. Harder sailed from Fremantle on August 5, 1944 with Dealey, in tactical command of a 3-boat group that included the Haddo, whose captain was Chester Nimitz, Jr., the son of the commander of the Pacific Fleet, and the Hake. Their patrol area was off the west coast of the Philippines, where the Americans were beginning to press in to retake the islands. Acting on more ultra-intelligence, the group set up across the path of a convoy coming out of Mindoro and tore into it on the morning of August 21st, joined by 3 more submarines. 4 ships went down with no damage to any of the attackers. In the days that followed, Harder and the Haddo worked north toward Manila Bay, hunting the smaller escort ships that had survived the convoy. The Japanese called these vessels kaiboken, a little lighter than an American destroyer escort, but armed much the same, and some accounts simply call them frigates. In a coordinated attack, the 2 boats left 3 of them crippled. At daybreak, Harder went back and finished off 2, the Matsuwa and the Hiburi, while the Haddo sank the 3rd. More than 100 Japanese sailors died on each of the 2 ships Harder put under. They were the last warships the post-war review would confirm to her name. Then the boats moved farther up the coast of Luzon, toward Desal Bay, to meet the Hake. On the morning of August 24th, Harder and the Hake lay off the mouth of the bay. The Hake's captain sighted 2 ships coming out, a 3-stack vessel and a smaller one, and misread them both. The smaller ship was a Japanese escort, the CD-22. The 3-stacker was stranger. She was a patrol boat the Japanese called PB-102, and she had once been the American destroyer Stewart, sunk and abandoned in a flooded dry dock at Java in 1942, then raised, repaired, cut down from 4 stacks to 3, and put back to sea under Japanese colors. All that year, American submariners kept reporting glimpses of what looked like a lost United States destroyer flying the wrong flag in waters far behind enemy lines. This was why the 2 ships sighted a periscope and turned to attack. The Hake's captain did not like the look of the situation in front of him and pulled away. And as he did, he saw Harder's periscope between his own boat and the oncoming CD-22. That was the last anyone in the American Navy ever saw of her. Minutes later, the Hake's crew heard 15 depth charges go off in quick succession. When the Hake came back over the spot that afternoon, there were marker buoys on the water and nothing more. The Japanese side of the action was pieced together long afterward. As the CD-22 ran in for her attack, 3 torpedoes passed close down her sides, 2 to port and 1 to starboard. Dealey had tried the down-the-throat shot one final time, fired into the bow of a charging escort the way he had off Tawi-Tawi, and this time he missed. The CD-22 began a methodical series of depth charge runs, each pattern set a little deeper than the one before, hunting downward for the boat she knew was somewhere beneath her. The fifth pattern found Harder. Oil, broken cork, and splintered wood rose to the surface where she had been. All 79 men aboard died with her. Samuel Dealey was 38 years old. Harder was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for her first 5 war patrols and 6 battle stars for her 6. Her captain received the Medal of Honor, granted after his death for the 5th patrol off Tawi-Tawi, the citation setting down in plain language the destroyers he charged and sank in those few June days. He was given a Silver Star as well for his final patrol. By the time it was all counted, he was among the most decorated submariners in the Navy's history, with 4 Navy Crosses, the Army's Distinguished Service Cross, and the Medal of Honor, nearly all of it earned inside a single year of war. For 80 years the boat herself was simply gone, her resting place somewhere off Luzon, known only in the rough. Then, in the spring of 2024, that changed. A group called the Lost 52 Project, led by Tim Taylor and working to locate all 52 American submarines lost in the Second World War, found a wreck in the South China Sea off the Philippine coast. Taylor's team had already located a string of other lost boats over the years, the Grayback and the Grunion among them, using archival detective work and autonomous underwater robots to sweep the floor of the sea. The Navy's underwater archaeologists studied the data and confirmed it. Harder sits upright on the bottom, more than 3,000 feet down, her hull whole, except for the damage aft of the conning tower where the depth charge caught her. The Navy treats the site as what it is, a war grave, the resting place of 79 men to be left in peace. It is worth being clear about what Harder was and what she was not, because the legend, for all its energy, slightly misses the boat it means to honor. She was not a lone wolf. She sailed with other submarines, fed her sightings to admirals, ferried commandos through enemy water, and pulled a downed pilot off a reef under fire. Her captain was not a reckless gambler. He turned down more shots than he took and lived by careful setups and cold patience, right up until the fatigue that everyone around him could see led him onto one patrol too many. The famous count of 5 destroyers in 5 days does not survive contact with the records. 3 of those sinkings do. What survives, and only grows the closer you look at it, is everything else. A submarine and a crew who hunted the hunters at the front door of an enemy fleet, who killed enough destroyers and rattled a Japanese admiral so badly that he pulled that whole fleet off its schedule, and who paid the full price for in the end, every man aboard. The arithmetic of the legend was always the least interesting thing about them. So remember Samuel Dealey of Dallas, Texas, the quiet man who smiled wider the worse things got, and who is still aboard his boat 3,000 feet beneath the South China Sea. Remember the 79 officers and enlisted men of Harder who went down with him on August 24, 1944, whose names are cut into memorials at home and who never came back to the families waiting on them. Remember the 4 who waded into the surf off Wolei for a stranger, and the rest of a crew who turned one ordinary fleet submarine into the most feared boat in those waters. And remember the men on the other side of Dealey's torpedoes, the crew of the Ikazuchi, who had once saved 400 drowning enemies and then drowned themselves 2 years later. The sailors of the Minazuki, the Hayanami, and the Tanikaze, most of whom went down with their ships in the dark. They were conscripts and professionals doing their duty in a war their leaders had chosen for them, and the sea closed over them the same as it did over the Americans. The other ship from that morning off Daysal Bay, the 3-stacker the Hake's captain Miss Reed, had a stranger fate still ahead of her, and following it to the end is the only way to close her account. While she was still flying Japanese colors in the spring of 1945, American Army aircraft caught her at Mokpo on the Korean coast and bombed her, the United States doing damage to a hull the United States had built a quarter-century before. When the war ended a few months later, occupation forces went looking for her and found her laid up in Hiro Bay near Kure, worn and rusting. On the 29th of October, in a ceremony that left more than one old sailor quiet, the the Navy took her back. She had no proper name anymore, only her old hull number, so they recommissioned her as DD-224, and her new crew gave her a nickname that fit the moment, Ramp 224, the letters standing for Recovered Allied Military Personnel. A lieutenant commander named Harold Ellison took command of her on the foredeck, while another American destroyer lay alongside. She started home across the same ocean she had crossed under the other flag, and she could barely make the trip. Her engines gave out near Guam, and she came into San Francisco Bay in early March of 1946 at the end of a tow line, flying a long homeward-bound pennant for a voyage she could not finish under her own power. There was no place for her in the post-war fleet. The Navy struck her from its list in April, decommissioned her in May, and on the 24th of that month towed her out past the Golden Gate and used her for target practice. Carrier planes worked her over, and a patrol craft finished her. The ship that had served two navies and survived her own reported death once already went down for good off the California coast. She did not stay lost. In the autumn of 2024, a survey team running autonomous robots across the seafloor inside the Cordell Bank Sanctuary, about 30 miles out from San Francisco, found her sitting where the old records said she should be. People had taken to calling her the ghost ship of the Pacific. 80 years after Harder went to the bottom hunting off Luzon, the one ship that got clear of her on that last morning turned up on the floor of a sea half a world away. She had worn, through every turn of it, the name of an old sailing Navy captain, Charles Stewart of USS Constitution, given her back in 1920. Few names ever survived a longer or stranger voyage. The two American boats that shared Harder's final patrol both came through the war. The Hake, whose skipper had watched Harder's periscope cross his bow and then heard the depth charges that killed her, kept on patrolling and lived to the end of it. So did the Haddo. Her captain on that cruise was Chester Nimitz, Jr., a lieutenant commander in his late 20s who happened to be the son of the admiral running the whole Pacific War for Pearl Harbor. The younger Nimitz had learned his trade the hard way on the early boats, in the thick of the same torpedo troubles that had plagued the early war, and on one attack he watched all 6 of his torpedoes blow up short of the target. An earlier Silver Star of his had been pinned on by his own father at Pearl Harbor. He won the Navy Cross for the work he and Harder and the Hake did together off the Philippines that August, stayed in through the rest of the war, later took a destroyer into action off Korea, and retired at last as a rear admiral. Before the war was even over, the Navy sent him back to the submarine school to run its torpedo and gunnery training, the same weapons that had failed so many crews now in the charge of a man who had watched them fail at sea. When Japan signed the surrender in Tokyo Bay in September 1945, the Hake and the Haddo were both there, anchored among a dozen American submarines gathered to watch the war end on a battleship's deck. Harder had helped clear the road to that morning and did not live to see it. Harder was one of 52 American submarines that went out during the war and never came back. The figure is exact, and it is the reason the group that found her calls itself the Lost 52. Behind are roughly 3,500 officers and enlisted men who died inside those hulls, most of them still down there where their boats came to rest. Most of the 52 were lost with every man aboard. Only a handful left any survivors at all. A few swimmers pulled from the water, a few men who lived out the war in prison camps and came home at the end. Set against the size of the force, it was the heaviest loss rate of any branch of the American Armed Services in the war, something close to 1 man in 5. The submarines were a small part of the Navy, a few thousand crewmen in a service of millions, and they did damage to Japan out of all proportion to their numbers, choking off the oil and ore and rice the home islands could not do without. They paid for it at a rate nothing else in the fleet came near. That is the work the Lost 52 sits inside. Each wreck the project puts a name to. Harder among them now is less an archaeological prize than an answer owed to families who waited 80 years to learn exactly where their man went down. Neither wreck is salvaged to be hauled up. Under American law, both Harder and the old Stewart count as sunken military craft to be mapped and recorded and then left exactly where they lie. Sam Dealey himself was never recovered and never will be. His name is cut into the walls of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery, among thousands of others the Pacific kept. There are memory markers for him at Arlington and in his home state of Texas, stones standing in for a grave that does not exist. He was one of only 7 submarine officers in the whole war to be given the Medal of Honor, and it was his widow who received the medal in his place. Edwina Dealey, whom he had married straight out of the Naval Academy, and who had followed him out to Honolulu in the pre-war years and raised their 3 children through the long absences of a submariner's life, accepted it for him in 1945, a year after the sea closed over Harder. He had come from a well-known Dallas family. His uncle was George Bannerman Dealey, the publisher who built the Dallas Morning News into an institution and campaigned for years to remake the western edge of the city's downtown. When that open square was finished, it was named for the uncle, Dealey Plaza, and 2 decades after Sam Dealey died at sea it became, on an afternoon in November 1963, the most photographed and most painful patch of ground in the country, the place where President Kennedy was shot. The family name reached the public memory along a road no one in the family would ever have chosen. Sam Dealey's own claim on it was quieter and made entirely underwater on the far side of the world. The Navy gave his name to a ship of its own. In late 1953, the Bath Iron Works up in Maine launched the lead vessel of a new class of escort, and Edwina Dealey, the same woman who had accepted his medal, swung the bottle across the bow. They called her USS Dealey. There was an irony in the choice that the men who made it surely felt. Dealey had built his name killing submarines from the deck of one, and the ship now carrying that name was designed for the opposite trade, a fast escort meant to hunt submarines through the cold water of a new and different standoff with a new rival. She served for 18 years, screened the fleet in the Mediterranean during a crisis off Lebanon, trained a generation of sonar men at Newport and Key West, and was handed in the end to the Navy of Uruguay, where she lived out her days under the name 18 de Julio before the breakers took her in 1991. So the name outlasted the man who carried it and the boat he carried it on. What it stands for has not shifted in the 80 years since. A submarine commander from Texas with a steadiness that unnerved the men who fought him, the 79 sailors who went into the South China Sea at his side, and the boat that took the war to the enemy's own Anchorage and stayed down there with them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.